He built an empire on a lie. His son built a bigger one on the truth. And now, the reckoning has arrived. If you've ever watched someone powerful get exactly what they deserve, not from the courts, not from the press, but from the child they threw away, then stay with me. This story will wreck you in the best possible way. Watch until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been coming down since 4 in the morning, not the soft Pacific Northwest drizzle that tourists photographed and locals ignored. This was the kind of rain that hit sidewalks like it had somewhere to be, that drummed against floor-to-ceiling windows with a persistence that made even confident men glance toward the glass. By the time Kang Jae-min's motorcade pulled into the underground parking structure beneath Blackstone Global's headquarters tower, the gutters along Fifth Avenue were running hard and brown, and the wind off Puget Sound had turned the corner of Pike Street into something close to hostile. Jae-min didn't notice the weather. He hadn't noticed weather in years. What he noticed, stepping out of the rear door of the black Escalade before his security detail had fully stopped moving, was that his phone showed 47 unread messages in the past 2 hours. He noticed that 3 of those messages were from his personal attorney, 2 were from his head of corporate intelligence, and the rest were from executives who never contacted him directly unless something had gone genuinely wrong. He noticed those things. He noticed them the way a man notices the smell of smoke before he sees a fire. But he was Kang Jae-min, the king of the Pacific Corridor, a man who had turned a regional freight brokerage into a $12 billion logistics empire spanning 14 countries and 4 continents. A man who had sat across negotiating tables from heads of state and never been the one who blinked. He was 61 years old, and he had spent the better part of 4 decades making sure that whatever went wrong in his world went wrong quietly, got fixed quickly, and never reached the level of his calendar. He pocketed the phone and walked toward the elevator without reading a single message. The 38th floor boardroom was already full when he arrived. That alone was unusual. Jae-min routinely appeared at meetings 5 to 7 minutes late, not from carelessness, but as a calibrated exercise in dominance. Rooms waited for him, not the other way. But today every seat was occupied before he cleared the threshold, and the silence that greeted him had a particular texture he didn't recognize. Not the focused professional quiet of a team ready to work. Something else. Something tighter. He scanned the room in the 2 seconds it took him to cross from the door to the head of the table. His CFO, Raymond Choi, sat with both hands flat on the surface in front of him, the way a man might sit when he's been told not to move. His general counsel, Patricia Wells, had a legal pad in front of her that appeared completely blank, which meant she'd been sitting there thinking rather than writing, which meant she was either very calm or very worried. His head of acquisitions, David Lim, was checking his phone under the table with the careful, guilty rhythm of a man trying to hide something. Jae-min set his briefing folder on the table and didn't sit. "Talk to me," he said. Nobody spoke for a beat too long. Then Marcus Reed, his chief security officer, former military intelligence, 20-year loyal, the kind of man who could read a threat assessment with the flat effect of someone ordering coffee, stood from his position near the far wall and crossed the room with a deliberate, measured pace that Jae-min had only seen him use twice before. Both times the information had been significant. Marcus reached him, leaned close, and said 6 words. "The buyer is your abandoned son." The room somehow got quieter. Jae-min stood completely still for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled back his chair, sat down with the careful precision of someone managing a physical injury, and folded his hands on top of the briefing folder. "Clear the room," he said. Nobody argued. They filed out in the professional, eyes-forward manner of people who understood they had just been witness to something they would be smart to pretend they hadn't seen. The door clicked shut and left Jae-min and Marcus alone at the long table, 38 floors above a rain-soaked city, with the kind of silence between them that had actual weight. Jae-min looked at the folder he hadn't opened. "How certain are you?" It wasn't a question. The inflection was flat. The flatness was deliberate. Marcus set a single photograph on the table. It was a long lens shot, slightly grainy in the way of professional surveillance photography taken at distance. A young man in his mid-20s crossing a street near the waterfront, collar up against the rain, moving with the particular forward-leaning urgency of someone who is always thinking 3 steps ahead of their feet. Jamin looked at the photograph for a long time. The jaw, the height, the particular angle of his shoulders against the wind. The Obsidian Ventures structure, Marcus said. We went 6 layers deep on the ownership chain. Shell companies, trusts, nominee directors. Clean as anything I've ever seen. Cleaner, honestly, than anything your team put together during the Meridian acquisition. Whoever built it had serious legal help and didn't make a single structural mistake across 7 years of transactions. 7 years. The first acquisition was in 2017, a small freight brokerage in Tacoma. 18 employees, regional routes, nothing you'd notice. We went back through every acquisition since and mapped them against your company's growth track. Every single one targeted a weakness or a dependency before we'd publicly identified it as one. Not guessing, not luck. Marcus paused. Somebody who understands how you think, how you build, what you need to grow, and what happens to you if specific pieces disappear. Jamin turned the photograph face down on the table. He didn't need to look at it anymore. The image was already somewhere it would be harder to remove. His name, Jamin said, Malik Caldwell. The name hit him differently than he'd expected. Not like a strike, more like the pressure change before weather. A full-body recognition that the atmosphere had shifted and whatever happened next was going to be determined by forces larger than his usual instruments of control. Caldwell. His mother's name. Nia Caldwell. Jamin was quiet for what felt to Marcus like a very long time, though his watch showed it was less than 40 seconds. Where's he now? As of this morning? 3 blocks from this building. He's been in Seattle for approximately 4 months. He's been watching. Jamin stood, turned to the window, and put both hands behind his back. Below him, Fifth Avenue ran with water and reflected light, and somewhere in the distance, through the rain and glass and the 38 floors of corporate architecture between him and the street, a man with his jawline and his height was standing somewhere thinking about him with a clarity and patience he had never once extended to the boy he'd erased. He stood there for a long time, looking at the rain. 24 years. The math was simple. The weight of it was not. In 2000, Jamin had been 37 years old, mid-ascent, already successful enough to be noticed by the people who moved money and positioned himself carefully in the world that mattered to him, the world of Pacific Rim logistics, of Port Authority relationships and cross-border freight negotiations, and the particular social architecture of being a Korean-American man building something real in an industry that had not previously seen one do so at his scale. He had met Nia Caldwell at a trade conference in Portland. She was there as a consultant attached to a mid-sized freight software company, sharp and funny and completely unimpressed by him in a way he wasn't prepared for. And he had pursued her with the same systematic intensity he brought to business development because it was, by then, the only mode he had. What followed was not simple and was not casual. It lasted 3 years. They were married quietly, a civil ceremony in a county courthouse in Multnomah County on a Thursday in February, 2 witnesses, no press. He told himself at the time that the privacy was practical, that a public wedding was an unnecessary exposure while he was still building, that they would do something proper when the time was right. The time never became right. What became right, instead, was opportunity. In 2001, the opportunity arrived in the form of a partnership offer from Choi Hyun-sang, one of the most powerful logistics figures in South Korea, who was looking to expand his U.S. operations and wanted a Korean-American face at the front of the venture, a man with credibility in both cultures, a man with strong family values, the specific phrase Choi's people used, and a clean, uncomplicated personal narrative. Clean and uncomplicated. Jamin had looked at what he was about to receive and the capital, the access, the networks, the scale, and he had looked at what he would have to trade for it, and he had made his calculation. It was not, in the moment, a difficult calculation. That was the part he had never admitted to anyone, and barely admitted to himself. It wasn't difficult. He had sat with it for perhaps 3 days, and on the 3rd day, he had picked up the phone and called his attorney and told him to begin preparing documents for an annulment proceeding on the grounds of a marriage contracted without the proper disclosure of Nia's pre-existing financial obligations, which was a legal framework and also a lie. Nia had been 4 months pregnant. At the press conference he held 2 weeks after the partnership announcement, a journalist from the Seattle Times asked him directly whether he had a personal relationship with Nia Caldwell, whose name had surfaced in public records attached to a Multnomah County marriage license. Jae-min had looked into the camera and said no. He had said it with the calm specificity of a man who had rehearsed the word until it no longer produced any particular sensation in his chest. He said no, and then he turned the page, and he never turned it back. Nia Caldwell had turned 49 in January. She had celebrated the birthday the way she celebrated most things. Practically, without ceremony, with strong tea and whatever book she was reading at the time. Her son had sent her flowers from New York, where he was supposedly attending a consulting conference, and she had put them in the window of the tea house where the afternoon light hit them, and told the 3 customers present that they were from her son, her voice carrying the quiet, unperformant pride of a woman who had earned that sentence through 24 years of very hard work. The tea house was called Slow Current. She'd opened it 11 years ago in the Madrona neighborhood, a narrow 2-story building with exposed brick walls and mismatched chairs and windows that ran floor to ceiling on the street-facing side. The name came from a line in a letter she'd written to Malik when he was 7, during a period when money was tight enough that she'd had to move them into a cheaper apartment in Tacoma and work 2 jobs simultaneously, and she'd been trying to explain to a child why moving was not the same as losing. She'd written, "We are like a slow current. We don't stop, we don't break, we just find the way through." He had kept that letter. She knew because she'd found it once, folded into the lining of a notebook he'd left at her apartment during his last semester of college, tucked there with the particular deliberateness of something a person carries rather than stores. She hadn't mentioned it. She never mentioned the things she noticed about him that would have embarrassed him to know she'd seen. That was their relationship. He was brilliant and controlled and had walls. The kind of walls a child builds when the first significant lesson life teaches them is that certain people cannot be counted on to stay. She had watched those walls go up over 24 years and had not tried to tear them down. What she had tried to do, with the consistency and patience of someone committed to a very long project, was make sure he knew there was always a door in them. He always knew where the door was. She was in the back room of the tea house, going through the week's inventory against the ordering system, when the bell above the front entrance chimed twice in quick succession. Malik's habitual knock equivalent, the 2-bell rhythm he used so she'd know it was him before she looked up. She looked up anyway. He came in wet. He hadn't bothered with an umbrella, which was consistent. He had never, in her memory, used one, which she'd once attributed to practicality and now understood was more about the fact that a man who had decided nothing was going to stop him had a particular relationship with weather. He was wearing a dark jacket, and the rain had soaked through to his collar, and he was carrying a paper bag from the Vietnamese place 2 blocks over that she liked, which meant he'd been thinking about this visit long enough to plan for it, which meant it wasn't casual. "You're wet," she said. "It's raining." "I know it's raining. I've been watching it rain since sunrise." He set the bag on this counter, unloaded 2 containers of bun bo hue, and found spoons without being told where they were. "He knows," Malik said. She didn't ask who. She set down her pen and straightened the edge of the inventory spreadsheet with one finger. "When?" "Today. This morning." His security team identified the ownership structure. A short pause. "They're better than I expected them to be, honestly. The firm that handled it charged him appropriately." "But you planned for it." "I've been planning for it for 6 years." She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way mothers do when they're doing something other than seeing. He was standing at the counter with his hands flat on the surface, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard at appearing undisturbed, the slight over-stillness that gave him away to her even when it gave nothing away to anyone else. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She moved the inventory sheets aside and pulled one of the soup containers toward her, even though she wasn't hungry, because eating together was a different kind of conversation than talking, and she needed this to be that kind of conversation. "Tell me where you are," she said. He understood she wasn't asking about geography. "I'm ready," he said. "Everything is in position. The Cascade Freight Division. That's the piece that breaks the whole structure if it goes. I have the controlling interest. The port access agreements run through an Obsidian subsidiary. His northern corridor is exposed. If I move in the next 30 days, Blackstone loses approximately 40% of its operating leverage in the Pacific markets." "And what does that look like?" "Restructuring, significant downsizing, Possibly a sale of the company within 2 years. You're talking about 3,000 people losing their jobs. Some of them. The strong division survive under new ownership. Malik. He stopped. She wasn't angry. Her voice didn't go sharp when she was serious. It went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone is about to say something that matters. I need you to hear me before this goes further, she said. Not as your strategist, not as your first investor, as your mother. Are you hearing me? Yes. You have built something extraordinary. You built it yourself, with almost nothing from anyone who was obligated to give it to you. I have watched you do that, and I have been so... She stopped, touched the edge of the soup container, started again. I have been so proud of you that it has sometimes been difficult to be in the same room as it. You understand that. He didn't answer. She took it as understanding. But you do not get to burn down something that cannot be rebuilt and tell me it was justice. That's not justice. That's just another kind of destruction. And I did not raise you to destroy things. He destroyed. I know what he destroyed. The quiet again. Absolute. I was there. I was the one who was there. Not you, me. And I am telling you, as the person who actually lost something, that what you're describing is not what I want. It is not what I'm asking you for. Malik looked at her. Then what are you asking me for? I'm asking you to let me be the one who decides what happens next. The rain drummed against the front windows. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she began eating her soup, not because she'd decided to, but because sitting in silence with him sometimes required something to do with her hands. All right, he said finally. There are rules, she said. I know there are rules. You don't know these rules. He looked at her. She set down her spoon. You will not destroy what cannot be rebuilt. Whatever you do, whatever we do, if the collateral damage affects people who had nothing to do with what he did, you pull back. Every time. No exceptions. He nodded. You will not lie to me. Not about the plan. Not about how you feel about it. Not about him. Whatever is happening in here, she touched her own chest with 2 fingers, briefly. You don't hide it from me. Not from me. Okay? You will not contact him without my knowledge. Not directly, not through intermediaries, not through lawyers, not through the press. If there is communication with Kang Jaemin, it comes through me. My terms. My timing. A pause. And if he ever comes asking for forgiveness, he won't. If he does, she said, I am the one who decides what that conversation looks like. Not you, not his lawyers, not his PR team. Me. Malik looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. And what are you going to do with those terms? She picked up her spoon again. I'm going to hold them very carefully, she said. And so are you. They ate the rest of the soup mostly in silence, and the rain kept coming, and slow current filled with the afternoon smell of tea and wet pavement. And across the neighborhood, somewhere in the direction of the waterfront, the lights of Blackstone Global's tower glowed through the gray, like something that had not yet figured out it was already on fire. But Jaemin did not go home that night. He sent his driver away at 7:30 and remained in the building, in his private office behind the boardroom, with the lights low and a glass of water he hadn't touched. Marcus stayed outside the door without being asked to. There were people Jaemin could have called. His attorney, his communications director, the crisis management firm he retained at significant annual expense for precisely these categories of emergency. There was a protocol for this. There was always a protocol. And the protocol would have involved controlled messaging and legal positioning and the careful management of information before it migrated from the known world into the unpredictable one. He didn't call anyone. He sat behind his desk and he thought about a Thursday in February in 2000 in a Multnomah County courthouse, and a woman in a green coat who had laughed at something a clerk said while they were waiting for their paperwork. And the way that laugh had sounded in that bureaucratic, fluorescent lit space, completely real, completely unperformable, completely itself. He thought about the drive back to Portland afterward, how she'd put her feet up on the dashboard, which she knew irritated him, specifically because she knew it irritated him. And she'd been eating from a paper bag of chips and listening to something on the radio, and she'd looked over at him at a red light and said, completely seriously, "You know this is terrifying, right? This is genuinely terrifying, and I just want to say that out loud because I think we should be allowed to say it." He had said, It's not terrifying, it's just paperwork. She had looked at him for a long moment and then looked back out the window and said, "You're going to be interesting to be married to." He thought about that. He thought about the press conference in 2001 and the way the journalist's question had landed. Not accusatory, actually, just factual, almost gentle. And he thought about how quickly and completely he had manufactured the number. The speed of it, the absence of anything like hesitation. He had been prepared, had rehearsed, and when the moment arrived, he had delivered the preparation like it was just another product. No. 24 years. A son he had never spoken to. A son who had been building in the dark, quietly, methodically, with apparent patience and apparent intelligence, and a plan structured well enough to fool his corporate intelligence team for 7 years. A son who had looked like him in the photograph, who had his jawline and his height, and apparently his capacity for strategic patience and his willingness to pursue a goal across years without anyone knowing he was doing it. Who had gotten all of that? The determination, the mind, the particular architecture of ambition, from a man who had stood in front of cameras and said no. Jaemin picked up the glass of water, put it down again. Outside the window, the rain had softened to something closer to mist, and the lights of the city blurred and scattered in the condensation on the glass. And he thought about a word for what he was feeling. And the only word he could locate was exposed, which wasn't quite right, but it was the closest thing available. Not afraid. Exposed. Like something that had been covered for a very long time had been uncovered, and now it was just sitting in the light, and light had a particular quality with certain things. It didn't explain them, it just made them impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His communications director. "Call me immediately. Critical." His attorney. "We need to talk before morning, tonight if possible." Victor Hanley, his second in command, who was also his chief operations officer and had been with Blackstone for 11 years. "I'm in the building if you need me. Whatever you need." He looked at Victor's message for a slightly longer moment than the others. Then he set the phone face down on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling. He stayed that way until well after midnight. He didn't call Victor. He didn't call anyone. Malik's apartment was on the 14th floor of a residential building 4 blocks from the waterfront, a corporate rental he'd taken under a name attached to one of the Obsidian holding companies, functional and temporary and entirely without character, which suited him. He had a habit, when he was working through something, of standing at windows. His mother called it his processing position. He called it thinking. He was at the window now, looking at the rain-softened lights of the city, with his phone on the table behind him and a half-finished cup of tea going cold on the kitchen counter, and the particular restlessness of a man who had been aimed at a single target for years and now found himself within range and waiting, which was the hardest kind of waiting there was. He had agreed to his mother's rules. He meant the agreement. He always meant his agreements with her, not because she would find out if he broke them, though she would, but because she was the standard he measured things against and had been since he was old enough to understand what standards were for. But he had also, he acknowledged to himself at the window, been living inside this plan for so long that the separation between the plan and himself had become narrow. He had built Obsidian Ventures not primarily as a business, though it was a business genuinely, a very good one, but as a targeting system. He had built it with the quiet, sustained ferocity of a man who needed somewhere to put what he felt about a father who had stood in front of cameras and said no. And now that system had found its target, and his mother had said, wait, she was right. He knew she was right with the part of him that had always known she was right. The part that had absorbed 24 years of watching her operate, never with rage, never with collapse, with a steadiness that was not passivity, but something harder and more structural. The kind of steadiness that meant she was still standing in her own building, in her own neighborhood, with her own name, while the man who had discarded her had spent 24 years building a life on top of a lie. She was right. He was still angry. Both things were true simultaneously, and he was adult enough to hold them in the same space without resolving the tension. He turned from the window and picked up his phone. There was a message from his head of legal, Serena Park, who was one of 4 people who knew the full scope of the Obsidian strategy. Serena had been his first hire, 6 years ago, a corporate attorney with a background in hostile acquisitions who had listened to his complete plan over 7 hours in a conference room in Manhattan and then said, with the professional equanimity of someone who found interesting problems genuinely interesting. This is achievable. It'll take the better part of a decade, and you'll need to be right about every major assumption. Are you right about every major assumption? Basic. He had said yes. She had said, let's start with the ownership structure. Her message tonight read, his security team confirmed the connection 90 minutes ago. My sources inside Blackstone say Jae-min went dark. Didn't call his communications team, didn't call his crisis managers. Went to his private office alone. That's unusual. That's not how he normally handles threats. What do you want to do? Malik looked at the message. Then he typed back. We wait. A pause. Then Serena. Your call. I'll hold everything at current status. Let me know when that changes. He set the phone on the table. The city glittered in the rain. Somewhere in that city, in an office 38 floors above the street, his father was sitting alone with something Malik had spent 6 years building toward delivering. He had expected to feel satisfaction. What he felt was more complicated than that, and he stood at the window in the dark for a long time, not quite naming it, the tea going cold on the counter, and the rain starting to ease and the lights of Seattle burning through the glass with the patient, indifferent brightness of a place that would still be there in the morning, regardless of what any particular man decided to do about his ghosts. It started coming apart 3 days later. Not Obsidian, not Malik's position, Jaemin's. The story broke in a financial news outlet. Not the full story, just the edge of it. A short piece about unusual acquisition activity in Pacific Freight Logistics pointing toward an undisclosed investment entity with holdings distributed across 6 Blackstone dependencies. The piece was careful, speculative, sourced anonymously. It asked questions rather than making claims. It was enough. By the end of the business day, Blackstone's stock had dropped 4%. By the following morning, 3 institutional investors had requested briefings. By the end of the week, 2 of Blackstone's major Port Authority partners had quietly initiated conversations with their legal teams about the terms of their operating agreements. Jaemin appeared publicly twice during this period, both times at previously scheduled events, both times with the composed, controlled effect of a man who treated markets the way he treated weather, as a condition to be managed, not feared. He answered questions with the calibrated precision of someone who had been managing public narratives for 30 years. But inside the building, Jae-min was moving differently. He had spent the 3 days after Marcus's revelation working through the documentation his intelligence team had assembled on Obsidian Ventures and Malik Caldwell, and what he found there, the intelligence of it, the architecture, the patience, had done something to him that market pressure and media attention and board scrutiny had never quite managed to do. It had made him feel the weight of 24 years as a specific, located thing, not abstract, not the general background discomfort he'd managed for 2 decades, an actual weight, sitting in an actual place, connected to actual choices. On the 4th morning, he came to a decision. He had his office contact Nia Caldwell's tea house at 11 a.m. The person who called identified themselves as a representative of Kang Jae-min's office requesting a brief conversation at Mrs. Caldwell's convenience. Nia had been expecting this. She had not expected it quite this quickly. She set down the cup she was holding and looked through the front windows at the street for a moment. Tell him I'll consider his request, she said. And when might... I'll consider it, she said. I'll be in touch. She hung up the phone. At the back table, a regular customer looked up from his laptop. Everything okay? Everything's fine, Nia said, and went back to cleaning the counter with the calm, methodical attention of a woman who had been waiting 24 years for this particular moment and had absolutely no intention of letting anyone else set the terms of it. She would call Malik tonight. She would tell him what had happened. She would not, however, tell him what she'd decided to do yet, because what she'd decided to do required her to be alone with it for a little while longer, to be sure that what she was feeling was what she actually intended, and not something that looked like it in the dark. She wiped down the counter, a slow current. She didn't stop. She didn't break. She just found the way through. Outside, the Seattle rain had finally cleared, and thin October light was moving across the wet pavement in the particular tentative way of sun that doesn't quite trust itself yet, and the tea house filled with the warm, quiet smell of tea steeping, and slow current continued its commerce, cups going out, cups coming back. And nobody who walked past the windows that morning would have known, looking in, that the woman behind the counter was standing at the exact center of a reckoning 24 years in the making, that she had already decided, that the only question remaining was whether the man she was about to face had any idea what it cost to sit at the table. She was willing, provisionally, conditionally, with every reservation intact, to set for him. He didn't know, but he was about to find out. The call that arrived at Blackstone Global at 4:17 p.m. on a Friday afternoon was not from Nia Caldwell. It was from Victor Hanley. He called Jaemin's direct line, which he had standing permission to use, and his voice when Jaemin answered carried the particular quality of someone who had been preparing this call for longer than the day. "There's something you need to know," Victor said. "About the Obsidian situation. About who else has been aware of it." Jaemin said, "I'm listening." Victor said, "Not on the phone." A pause. "My office, 7 o'clock." Jaemin hung up. He stood behind his desk for a moment, looking at the phone. Something in Victor's voice had snagged on something, the way a thread catches on a rough edge. Not dramatic, not certain, just a small, slight pulling that you notice, and then spend the next several hours noticing that you noticed. Victor Hanley. 11 years. Loyal, competent, ambitious in the specifically useful way that second-in-commands needed to be ambitious. Ambitious enough to work hard, careful enough not to reach. Or so Jaemin had always assumed. He looked at the city through the window. 7 o'clock. He would find out then. But standing there in the last light of the afternoon, with the Puget Sound visible in the distance and the financial district humming its ordinary Friday hum, 38 floors below, Kang Jae-min had the specific, quiet, certain sensation, the kind you don't argue with, the kind that arrives fully formed. That he was standing at the edge of something that had been coming for a very long time, and that whatever Victor said tonight was not going to be the most important thing that happened to him this month. The most important thing was the woman who had said, "I'll consider it." The most important thing was a son he had never spoken to, standing somewhere in this city, watching him with the patience of someone who had been building toward this exact moment since before he was old enough to fully understand what he was building toward. The most important thing was 24 years. The most important thing was the no he'd said in front of cameras, and the life that no had made, and the life it had unmade, and the fact that both of those things, what it had made and what it had unmade, were now standing in the same city as each other and moving slowly toward the same room. He didn't know what that room looked like yet. He didn't know if there was a version of what came next that left him still standing. But for the first time in 24 years, Kang Jae-min looked out at his city, his empire, his achievement, the monument to everything he'd chosen, and found that what he felt about it was not pride. What he felt was something closer to exhaustion, and something else, smaller and more dangerous, that he couldn't yet name. The light changed. The city shifted. Friday moved toward evening. And somewhere 3 blocks away, in a tea house called Slow Current, a woman set 2 cups on a windowsill and looked at the light coming through the glass and began, quietly, to decide exactly what kind of table she was willing to set. Victor Hanley arrived at Jaemin's office at 6:53, 7 minutes early. That was the first thing. Victor was never early. He operated on a precise, calibrated punctuality that Jaemin had always read as professionalism, and now, standing behind his desk, watching the man cross the threshold, he read differently, as the punctuality of someone who had been sitting outside the door, working up to something. Victor was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with the groomed, maintained appearance of a man who understood that looking the part was itself a form of power. He had come up through logistics operations, had run 3 regional divisions before Jaemin brought him to the executive level, and in 11 years he had never once given Jaemin a reason to question his loyalty. That was the second thing. 11 years of no reasons. Jaemin had spent the afternoon thinking about that number. "Close the door," Jaemin said. Victor closed it. He crossed to the sitting area, 2 low chairs angled toward each other near the window, and sat without being invited to, which was also unusual, and Jaemin came around the desk and sat in the other chair and looked at him. "Talk," Jaemin said. Victor put his elbows on his knees and looked at the middle distance between them for a moment, the way a man looks when he's deciding which version of a prepared speech to use. "I've known about Obsidian for 4 months," he said. The room got very still. I became aware of the ownership structure in June. I had a private security firm working an unrelated background check on a potential acquisition target, and the firm's analyst flagged an anomaly in the Cascade Freight ownership chain. The chain terminated in an Obsidian subsidiary. Victor paused. I pulled on the thread. For 4 months, Jae-min said. Yes. And you said nothing? No. The window behind Jae-min held the last of the evening light, orange and thin, the kind that exists for about 11 minutes in Seattle in October before the dark comes down completely. Victor's face was half in it and half in shadow. Why? Jae-min said. Not angry yet. The voice of a man collecting information before he decides what to feel about it. Victor looked at him directly, because I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I brought it to you. The scale of it, the structure, what it meant for the company's position. A short pause. And because once I understood what I was looking at, I needed time to think about what I was going to do with it. What you were going to do with it. Yes. Jae-min leaned back slightly in the chair. And what did you decide you were going to do with it? Victor held his gaze. I'm here, aren't I? You're here 7 minutes early after 4 months of silence. Walk me through what changed. Something moved across Victor's face, not guilt exactly, more like the controlled expression of a man releasing something he'd been holding at cost. I made contact with Obsidian, he said, 3 months ago. Through an intermediary. I wanted to understand what they wanted, what the end game was, whether there was a conversation to be had. Jae-min said nothing. I met with one of their people, a lawyer named Serena Park. She was professional, careful. She confirmed that Obsidian had a specific strategic objective related to Blackstone's Pacific Corridor holdings, and that the timeline for moving on that objective was within the current fiscal year. Victor stopped. She also told me, not explicitly, but clearly enough, that there was a version of this outcome in which certain executive positions within the restructured entity could be retained, depending on how cooperation was structured. The silence this time was different in quality from the previous ones. Jae-min looked at Victor with the same flat attention he brought to documents he was reviewing for errors, the specific focused patience of finding exactly where the problem was located before marking it. She offered you a seat, Jae-min said. She indicated one might be available. And you came here tonight to tell me this because I went back to them 2 weeks ago. I told them I was prepared to provide internal documentation that would accelerate their position significantly. Operational structure, dependency mapping, the Port Authority Agreement terms. Victor's jaw was tight. They thanked me and said they'd be in touch. I haven't heard from them since. Jae-min looked at him. They used you, Jae-min said. Victor didn't answer. They let you think you were negotiating, and they took what you gave them, and now they don't need you anymore. Jae-min stood. He moved to the window, put his hands behind his back, and looked at the dark water in the distance. What documentation did you provide? The Q3 operational review, the Port Access Agreement side letters, the Meridian Dependency Analysis, the side letters. Jae-min's voice was absolutely level. Those are confidential instruments. Those are the terms that govern 30% of our Northern Corridor capacity. You gave those to the people who are trying to take this company apart. And you are standing in my office telling me this because they stopped returning your calls. I'm telling you because it was wrong. Victor's voice had something in it now, not quite remorse, more like a man who has looked at what he's done and found the shape of it uglier than he'd expected. I made a calculation that I believed was practical, and I was wrong about it. I'm telling you because you needed to know. Jae-min turned from the window. He looked at Victor Hanley for a long, quiet moment. 11 years of working breakfasts and crisis management and shared strategy and the particular intimacy of men who have navigated serious problems together. And underneath all of that, apparently, this. A man who had decided his own survival mattered more than the loyalty he'd accepted compensation for. You're suspended, Jae-min said, effective tonight. You will not access company systems. You will not contact company personnel, and you will not speak to anyone, about what you've just told me until I have spoken with legal. Do you understand? Victor stood. Jae-min, do you understand? A long beat. Yes, Victor said. He crossed to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. When I found out who Obsidian actually was, who specifically was behind it, I thought about walking away from the whole thing. I thought about it for a long time. Jamin looked at his back. But you didn't, Jamin said. Victor opened the door and left. Jamin stood in the middle of his office for a moment, then went to his desk and picked up the phone and called Marcus Reed. I need a full audit of every system Victor Hanley accessed in the last 6 months, he said. Tonight. And I need to know how much damage those side letters can do in someone else's hands. Marcus said, I'll start now. One more thing. Jamin looked at the window. Find out if there's any record of contact between Hanley and the Obsidian organization prior to June. I want to know if 4 months is the real number or a comfortable one. He hung up. He stood at the desk for another moment, and what moved through him was not quite anger. It was something more structural than that, a deep, load-bearing shift, the kind that happens when something you'd built a significant portion of your understanding of the world on turns out to have been sitting on compromised ground. He had trusted Victor Hanley. He had trusted almost no one, and Victor had been one of them. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began reading the Q3 operational review from memory, mapping what was in it against what Obsidian's team could build from it. And the picture that assembled itself was not good, and he sat with it until after 10 o'clock when Marcus called back and told him the preliminary audit showed Hanley's access to the side letters had occurred twice, once in the documented period and once 14 months ago. 14 months ago. Thank you, Jamin said, and hung up, and sat in the dark office for a while longer. Nia called Malik at 9:15. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for it. He reached out, she said. A short silence. I know, Serena flagged the call to your tea house. You had people monitoring my business line. I had people monitoring his outgoing communications. Your number came up in the log. A pause. I should have told you that was happening. Yes, she said. You should have. She was sitting at the small table in her apartment above the tea house, a cup of tea in front of her that she'd been reheating twice without drinking. The apartment was quiet and worn in the specific way of a space that had housed someone's actual life for a long time. Books stacked in ways that made sense only to her, a coat on the back of a chair, shoes by the door in a particular order. He reached out faster than I expected, she said. I know. It means something knocked him off his usual approach. She considered that. What knocked him? Victor Hanley. A pause, and she could hear Malik deciding how much to tell her, which she recognized immediately and waited for him to stop deciding. Hanley made contact with Serena 3 months ago. He offered internal documentation in exchange for a position in the restructured entity. And you took the documents. Serena took the meeting and assessed the situation. We took the documents that were useful and declined to proceed further with Hanley. You used him and dropped him. We didn't solicit his cooperation. He came to us. Malik. She set down the cup. That is the kind of thing you should have told me. The silence on his end had a particular texture, not defensive, more like a man who knows he's right, and also knows that being right is not the point. You're right, he said. I should have. Did you know it would send him back to Jayamin? I thought it was possible. Did you plan for it? A longer pause. The documents Hanley provided gave us the side letter terms on the port access agreements. With those terms, we can accelerate the Cascade freight position significantly. We don't need another month. We can move in 2 weeks. Nia was quiet. That wasn't what I asked you, she said. No, Malik said. I knew it would send him back. She stood up and walked to the window and looked at the street below. Wet and quiet at this hour, the tea house dark, a single streetlight making a circle on the pavement. You are using people, Malik. I'm running a strategy. Those are the same thing and you know it. Her voice was still quiet. It hadn't moved. Victor Hanley is a man who made a bad choice, and you accelerated his collapse deliberately and sent him back into that building knowing what it would do to his standing there. That man has a life. That man handed over confidential documents to a competitor. He made his own choices. Yes, and you shaped the conditions that made those choices feel available to him. She turned from the window. I'm not defending him. I'm telling you there is a difference between what you said you were doing and what you are actually doing. You said you were building a case. You are running people. There is a cost to that, and it does not only land on the people who deserve it. The line was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to do? He said. I want you to tell me the full picture, not the version you've decided I should have, the complete picture. Another pause. Then Malik began to talk. He talked for 22 minutes. He told her about the Hanley contact and the side letters. He told her about the acceleration of the Cascade freight timeline. He told her about two other Blackstone dependencies, a cold storage operation in Tacoma and a cross-border customs brokerage, that Obsidian had quietly acquired controlling interests in over the previous 8 months and had not yet activated. He told her that with all three positions live, Blackstone's Northern Pacific corridor would effectively be inoperable within 60 days. Not destroyed, not bankrupted, inoperable, dependent on terms dictated by Obsidian. He told her that the position was strong enough now that Jamin had no counter that didn't involve significant loss. When he finished, she was standing at the kitchen counter with her hand flat on the surface, and the tea had gone fully cold. When were you going to tell me about the cold storage and the customs brokerage? She said. When they were relevant. They're relevant now. Yes. Malik, she pressed her fingers against the counter. I'm asking you directly. Is there anything else? Any piece of this plan that I don't currently know about? He was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them. There's a media element, he said. A journalist at the Post has been working a story on Blackstone's ownership structure for 6 months. I've been facilitating her access to certain public documents. Nothing confidential, nothing illegal, but I've been helping the story develop. What story? The story of a man who built a $12 billion company on a foundation that included abandoning a wife and child. The story of what that kind of personal foundation looks like when the business structure around it is examined carefully. Nia stood very still. You're going to put me in a newspaper, she said. Not you specifically. The structure of... A journalist is writing a story about a man who abandoned a black woman and their son. I am the black woman. I am specifically in that story whether my name is in it or not. Her voice was level and precise and completely without softness. You did not tell me about this. I was protecting... Don't. The word landed flat and hard. Don't tell me you were protecting me. You were protecting the plan. I am not a variable in your plan. I am your mother, and you do not get to make decisions about my life and my story and my name without my knowledge and call it protection. The silence this time was long. When Malik spoke, his voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. The operational steadiness that he wore like a professional garment, and what was underneath it was younger and less managed. I know, he said. I know. I'm sorry. She breathed out slowly. I need you to call that journalist, she said. Tonight. You tell her the story is on hold until further notice. You tell her that from me. Nia... Tonight, Malik. A pause. Okay. And then I need you to come here tomorrow morning, early. We are going to sit down and you are going to show me everything, every piece, every position, every decision you have made in the last year that touches this. Do you understand me? Yes. She picked up the cold tea and poured it in the sink. I love you, she said. You know that. I know. And I am furious with you right now. I know that too. She hung up and stood at the sink for a moment with the water running, washing out the cup with the systematic thoroughness of someone who needs to do something with their hands. Jimin was in the building at 6:30 the next morning. His assistant Clara arrived at 7 to find him already at his desk with 3 empty coffee cups and a legal pad covered in handwriting, which was unusual. Jamin typed, almost always. And she left him with a fresh cup without comment, which was the specific skill she'd developed over 9 years of working for him. At 8:15, a call came through from Raymond Choi. The CFO's voice had the particular quality of someone who has been awake most of the night and has arrived at the part of the night where alarm has metabolized into a cold, practical assessment. The side letters, Raymond said. I know, Jamin said. If those terms are in the market, if Obsidian's team has modeled our port access structure against those terms, they know exactly where we're exposed. They know the renegotiation windows. They know what we can and can't do. Raymond paused. They can sit on the Cascade freight position and just wait. We'll start losing partners to uncertainty before they have to make a single move. I know, Jaemin, I need to know what you want to do. The board is going to ask for a meeting by end of week. I can delay it, but not past Friday. Set it for Thursday. And what do I tell them? Tell them I'll have a plan. He hung up and looked at the legal pad. He had been writing in the early hours of the morning with the particular uninhibited honesty that 3 a.m. produces in people who have been avoiding something for 24 years, not a plan. He had been writing something closer to an accounting, not financial, the other kind. The things he'd traded and what he'd gotten for them. The things he'd said and the architecture of lies required to maintain them. The people who had been in the building before and were no longer in it, not fired, but somehow evacuated over years. The ones who had known about Portland, who had been around in 2001, who had been quietly managed away from proximity to anything that might surface what he'd done. He'd been thorough. That was the word he'd used to himself at the time. Thorough. Now, reading what he'd written in the early morning dark, the word that occurred to him was different. He pulled up his personal email on his phone and stared at the draft he'd started writing at 2 a.m. and had not sent. 3 sentences addressed to a general contact address for Slow Current Tea House. He stared at it for a while. Then he added a 4th sentence and hit send before he could revise it into something more controlled. He set the phone down. Clara knocked at 9 o'clock. There's a call from the financial news desk at the Post. They're asking for comment on a story about Blackstone's ownership dependencies, specifically about the Cascade Freight acquisition history. Jaemin looked up. Who's the byline? A journalist named Kim Dawson. The name didn't mean anything to him directly, but the timing did. He thought about Victor's meeting with Serena Park. He thought about 14 months. He thought about the side letters and the cold storage operation and the fact that whatever was coming had been built out of view, piece by piece, by someone who understood that the most effective kind of pressure was the kind you didn't feel until it was already structural. Tell her we'll have a statement by end of business, he said. Clara nodded and left. Jaemin looked at the phone, sitting face up on the desk, with the sent message confirmation still on the screen. 4 sentences. He had not asked for anything in those 4 sentences. He had not made any offers or any defenses. He had said only that he understood an approach had been made to her office, that he was not asking for a meeting, that if she chose to speak with him, he would come to a location of her choosing, at a time of her choosing, with no staff and no security, and that he was not sure what the appropriate word was for what he owed her, but he understood that it was more than he had ever been willing to pay. He did not know if she would respond. He did not know if he deserved a response. What he knew, sitting at the desk on which he'd built $12 billion of legitimate commercial enterprise, was that somewhere in this city, a man with his jaw and his height had been watching him for 4 months, and had not, yet, moved. And the reason for that, he suspected, was sitting in a tea house 3 blocks away, holding terms he hadn't yet been allowed to read, with a patience that had outlasted everything he'd thought he'd gotten away with. His phone lit up. Not the sent message screen. A new message from an unknown number. 4 words. Tomorrow. 11 a.m. Alone. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the legal pad and the 3 empty coffee cups and the morning light coming through the Seattle gray, and for the first time in a very long time, Kang Jae-min felt the precise, vertiginous sensation of a man who has been in control of every room he's entered for 30 years, walking toward a room where someone else sets the cafe Nia chose was called Harbor Grind. It was 12 minutes from Slow Current on foot, situated on a corner in the Eastlake neighborhood where the street curved toward the water and the morning foot traffic ran to dog walkers and people with laptop bags and young mothers with strollers who treated the sidewalk like shared infrastructure. It was not the kind of place Kang Jae-min would have chosen for any meeting in his professional life. The chairs didn't match. The music was something ambient and low that had no particular agenda. The counter staff were 2 women in their 20s who did not look up when the door opened. That was precisely why Nia had chosen it. She arrived 8 minutes early, ordered tea, the house blend, which was serviceable, not remarkable, and took a table near the window where she could see both the door and the street. She was wearing a gray cardigan and had her hair pulled back, and she looked, to anyone who glanced at her, like a woman waiting for a friend. She was not waiting for a friend. She had told Malik that morning, across her kitchen table with the full documentation of Obsidian's position spread between them and the remains of breakfast pushed to the side, that she was going alone. He had not argued. They'd already spent 90 minutes going through everything, and the argument she'd had the energy for was already spent. But when she stood to leave, he had said very quietly, "If anything feels wrong, you walk out. You don't explain it, you just leave." She had looked at him. "I know how to leave a room," she said. He had looked back at her with the expression he made when he was trying to look like he wasn't worried, which was the clearest possible signal that he was. She'd touched his shoulder once, briefly, and gone. Jaemin came through the door at 11 o'clock exactly. He was alone. She noted that first, checked the street behind him through the window, watched the door for 30 seconds after he entered, and saw no security, no trailing presence, no parked vehicles with occupants. He had come exactly as she'd asked. He was in a dark coat, no tie, and he looked. She assessed this with the detached precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a long time. Tired. Not performing tiredness. Actually tired, in the specific way of someone who had stopped sleeping properly, not in the last few days, but over a longer arc. He was thinner in the face than the photographs she'd seen. He was 61, and it showed in the way it showed in men who had been running hard for 40 years, the body beginning to send invoices for what the will had borrowed. He saw her immediately. He crossed to the table without stopping at the counter and stood for a moment, not sitting. "Thank you," he said, "for agreeing to—" "Sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at him across the small table, and she felt, moving through her chest with the specific gravity of something she'd been managing for 24 years, a sensation she could not quite name. Not rage. Not grief. Something more structural than either of those. The feeling of standing in a room you've imagined so many times that when you finally stand in it, the imagined version and the real version exist simultaneously, and neither fully cancels the other out. "I have 1 hour," she said. "You can use it however you want. I will listen. I won't argue with you, and I won't perform anything for you. When the hour is over, I'm going to stand up and leave, and whatever you haven't said by then you'll have to carry with you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Then talk." Jaemin looked at his hands on the table for a moment. He had not ordered anything. She noticed that he didn't appear to be managing his presentation. No visible preparation, no the way he's about to deliver a position. He just looked at his hands and then looked at her and began. He talked for 51 minutes. He told her about the Choi partnership offer in 2001 and the calculation he'd made. He told her about the 3 days he'd spent deciding, which he described with a specificity that she had not expected. The exact apartment he'd been living in, the view from the window, the coffee he'd been drinking each morning while he sat with it. He told her that what he'd felt during those 3 days was not, as he had told himself for 24 years, a strategic assessment. He told her it was fear, specifically and simply fear, of losing what he was building, of being seen by the men whose approval structured his world as a man who had made choices they would not sanction. Fear of being Korean American in an industry still shaped by men who found that combination conditional, and of adding to that conditionality a Black American wife and a mixed-race child, and of watching everything he was reaching for move away from him. He told her that the fear had not felt, in the moment, shameful. It had felt practical. He addressed it in practical language and practical logic and practical execution, and he had performed that practicality so thoroughly and for so long that he had eventually stopped being able to locate the fear underneath it. He told her about the press conference. He described the journalist's question with the particular clarity of a man who has replayed something thousands of times. He told her he had said no with no hesitation, not because he was certain, but because certainty was what the moment required, and he had manufactured it the way he manufactured everything, through preparation and control, and the absolute refusal to let the inside show on the outside. He told her he had thought about her. Irregularly, not constantly, but with a frequency that had not diminished the way he'd expected it to. He told her he had thought about the courthouse and the green coat and the chips in the car on the way back, and that those thoughts had functioned over the years, not as guilt exactly. He was honest about this, which she noted, but as a specific kind of weight that he had learned to carry without acknowledging he was carrying it. He told her he had not thought about the boy often. That was the hardest part to say, and she could see it cost him something to say it accurately rather than in a version more favorable to himself, and she sat with it and did not respond to it. He said, I didn't let myself think about him because thinking about him required thinking about what he was growing up inside of. And I couldn't think about that and keep doing what I was doing. So I didn't. Nia looked at him. She said nothing. He said, I don't know what I'm asking you for. I don't think I have the right to ask you for anything. I came here because you gave me an hour and I wanted to use it honestly, whatever that is worth to you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her tea, which had gone cold, and drank the last of it, and set the cup down with the specific deliberateness of someone completing an action. She stood. His hour was not over. She had 4 minutes remaining. She used them to put on her coat, button it carefully, and pick up her bag. Jae-min sat at the table and watched her do this, and did not speak, which was the first sign she'd seen that he might, in fact, understand what she'd told him. She wasn't there to negotiate. She wasn't there to respond. She was there to let him speak the truth out loud into the air of an actual room where it would be real in a way it couldn't be inside his head. And then she was going to leave him with it. She left him with it. She walked out into the East Lake morning without looking back, and the door swung shut behind her, and she stood on the sidewalk in the cold air for a moment with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the middle distance, and she breathed in and out 4 times, steadily, and then she began walking back toward Slow Current. She did not cry. She had done her crying for this particular subject across a span of years in which she'd also raised a son and built a business and rebuilt her financial life from essentially zero, and the crying was finished. What she felt now was different and less legible, and she was not ready to name it. She walked. Behind her in Harbor Grind, Kang Jae-min sat at the table for a long time without moving. The ambient music played. The counter staff talked to each other about something ordinary. He sat there until a couple came in and looked around for available tables, and then he stood, left a 20 on the table for the tea he hadn't ordered, and walked out into the cold. The story broke at 4:17 p.m. Not the Post, not Kim Dawson's piece, which was still, per Malik's instruction 2 nights before, on hold. A different outlet, a financial blog with serious institutional readership, run by a former Wall Street analyst named Carson Reed, who had 600,000 subscribers and a reputation for accuracy on corporate ownership structures. The headline read, Blackstone Global's Pacific Corridor, Who Actually Owns the Infrastructure? The piece was careful and sourced. It laid out the Obsidian Ventures acquisition history with the precision of someone who had been given access to good documentation. It traced the Cascade freight chain, the cold storage operation, the customs brokerage. It mapped the dependencies against Blackstone's reported operational structure and asked, in the flat declarative tone of financial analysis, what the exposure looked like if those 3 positions were activated simultaneously. It did not mention Malik. It did not mention Nia. It did not mention 2001 or Portland or a press conference or a marriage license in Multnomah County. It didn't need to. The financial story was enough. Blackstone's stock dropped 6% in after-hours trading within 40 minutes of publication. By 5 o'clock, Jae-min's phone contained 11 calls from board members, 3 from institutional investors, and 1 from the Port Authority's general counsel, who did not identify himself by name in the voicemail, but whose voice Jae-min recognized from 30 years of working the same industry. Marcus Reed appeared in Jae-min's office doorway at 5:20. The blog piece, Jae-min said. Carson Reed, former Goldman, runs a subscription service. His sourcing on ownership structures is usually primary document-based. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door. The documentation in that piece is internal. It's not the side letters. Those aren't in it directly. But the operational mapping, the way the dependencies are described, that's not public record analysis. Someone gave him the architecture. Hanley, Jae-min said. Possibly, but the timeline doesn't fit cleanly. Hanley's access to that specific operational mapping. Who else? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I need to keep pulling, he said. I don't want to give you a name until I'm sure. How long? 24 hours. You have 12. Marcus left. Jae-min stood at the window. The after-hours numbers were still moving. He watched them on the secondary monitor with the particular quality of attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading markets and currently cannot determine whether what he's watching is a correction or a collapse, and the uncertainty itself, the not knowing, was the part he was least equipped for. Because Jae-min's entire operational architecture was built on removing uncertainty before it became consequential. He picked up the phone and called Raymond Choi. "I need a liquidity assessment," he said. "Worst case, if all three positions activate simultaneously, where do we land?" Raymond was quiet for 3 seconds. "You want the honest number or the number I'd give the board?" Raymond, "Okay." A breath. "If Cascade Freight is inoperable, if we lose the cold storage operational agreements, and if the customs brokerage terms get renegotiated adversarially, we're looking at a 43 to 48% reduction in Northern Corridor revenue. We can absorb that for approximately 8 months before we're in restructuring territory. If investor confidence continues to erode, which it will if this keeps moving in the press, that window narrows to 5 months, maybe 4. And if we try to buy back into any of those positions at current market, we'd be buying at a premium we set by our own exposure. Whoever holds those positions knows exactly what they're worth to us." Raymond paused. "Jae-min, whoever built this, they didn't build it to sell it back to you. They built it to have the conversation you don't want to have." Jae-min stood at the window. "I know," he said. He hung up. At 6:45, his email produced a message from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The body contained 4 words and a document attachment. The 4 words were, "You should read this." The attachment was a 14-page brief. He opened it. It was the story Kim Dawson had been building for 6 months. The full version, not the piece that was on hold. The version with sourcing. The version with the Multnomah County marriage license and the 2001 press conference transcript, and a timeline of Nia Caldwell's financial circumstances in the years following the annulment, and a detailed account of Malik Caldwell's professional history from his first job out of college to the founding of Obsidian Ventures. It was meticulously documented. It was also, he understood immediately, not published. Someone had sent him the draft. He read it once, quickly. Then he read it again slowly, and the second read was different from the first because the first time he was assessing it as a document, what it contained, what it proved, what it could do, and the second time he was reading it as a record of something that had actually happened in the actual world to actual people. And the distance between those two modes of reading was the distance between the man he had been for 30 years and something he couldn't yet name, his son. The document described his son with the specificity of good reporting. Not warm, not hostile, just accurate. The details of what Malik had built, the intelligence of how he'd built it, the particular sustained patience of a man who had started a plan in his mid-20s and executed it over 7 years without a single material error. Jae-min sat at his desk. His phone was ringing. He could see the screen, Raymond again, and a board member, and Clara from the front desk who never called this late unless something had broken through the ordinary channels of escalation. He ignored all of it. He was looking at a line in the document, a section from an interview Kim Dawson had conducted with a former classmate of Malik's from his MBA program, a woman who described him as the most controlled person she had ever met, and who said he never talked about his father, not once, in 2 years. Every time something came up, family, background, anything personal, he would redirect so smoothly you almost didn't notice it had happened, like he'd been practicing that redirect his whole life. Jae-min put the phone face down on the desk, a child who had spent his entire life practicing the redirect. The practical architecture of a child who had learned very early that certain things had to be managed rather than felt, because feeling them had no utility, because the man who should have been the reference point for how a person held their pain and moved through the world had instead been a lesson in how completely and efficiently a person could be erased. He had built that in his son, not intentionally, not with his presence, with his absence. He had built it anyway. The phone rang again. He stood. He crossed to the window and stood there, and the city was doing its evening thing. Lights coming on, traffic moving, the ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what was happening in this specific room. And he stood there with his hand on the glass, and for the first time in 24 years, Kang Jae-min felt the full, unmanaged weight of what he had done. Not the fear of consequences, not the strategic assessment of exposure, the actual weight. It was considerable. His phone produced a new notification, a text from an unknown number, different from Nia's, that said only, "The document you just read. I sent it. I need you to understand what exists before you make your next move. M. Malik." Jamin stared at the text. His son had sent him the draft story. Not published, not weaponized. Sent directly to him, privately, so he would know what was out there, so he would understand the full dimension of what could happen. Not as a threat, but as information. The way you give information to someone you are allowing to make a choice, rather than someone you have already decided to destroy. His hands were not steady. He noticed that. He noticed it with the specific, stripped-down attention of a man who had just had something fundamental shift underneath him, the way you notice your own hands when everything else has gone uncertain. He typed back, "Why are you giving me this?" He waited. 40 seconds. Then, "Because she asked me to." He stood at the window with the phone in his unsteady hands, and the city spread out below him, unchanged and indifferent, and somewhere in it, 3 blocks away, a woman who had every reason to let him burn was apparently still, somehow, deciding that he deserved the... He called Victor Hanley at 7:03 in the morning. Not from his office line, from his personal cell, which Victor would not have been expecting, and the fact that Victor picked up on the first ring told Jamin everything he needed to know about the state Victor had been in since the suspension. "I need you to come in," Jamin said. A short silence. "You suspended me." "I'm aware. Come in anyway. 9 o'clock. Use the parking structure entrance." He hung up before Victor could respond. He had been in the building since 5:30. He had not slept in any meaningful sense. 2 hours on the couch in the private room behind his office, the kind of unconsciousness that is less sleep than a brief system shutdown. And he'd come out of it at 4:45 with his heart going hard and a clarity that felt chemical rather than rested. He had showered in the executive bathroom, changed into the spare suit he kept in the closet for late nights and early mornings, and by 5:30 he was at his desk with coffee and the 14-page draft document open on his screen. He had read it 4 times. Each time he read it, he found something he'd missed or not fully registered, a detail or a date or a particular phrasing that settled into him with new weight. The 4th read he had gone through slowly, paragraph by paragraph, and he had done something he hadn't done since he was a young man building his first business plan. He had annotated it. In the margins of the printed copy, in handwriting that was tighter and less legible than usual, he had written single words next to specific passages. Next to the section on Nia's financial circumstances in 2002 and 2003, he had written, "I knew." Next to the section on Malik's first year of college, which he'd attended on a combination of scholarship and a night job at a shipping depot in Tacoma, he had written, "I knew nothing." Next to the section describing Malik's founding of Obsidian Ventures, the anonymous structure, the 7-year build, he had written a word he crossed out immediately and rewrote, "deliberate." Then crossed that out too. Then written, finally, in smaller letters, "earned." He looked at that word for a while, then he picked up the phone and called Marcus Reed. "Victor Hanley is coming in at 9, he said. "I need you here for that conversation, and I need the full audit results before then." "I have them," Marcus said. "You're not going to like the number." "Tell me now." 14 months of irregular access. Not just the side letters and the Q3 review. He accessed the Port Authority relationship files, the individual contact histories, the personal terms we have with the 3 key commissioners. He accessed the Meridian integration roadmap. He accessed the company succession documentation. A pause. "Jamin, the succession documentation includes your personal trust structure and the executive continuity provisions." Jamin was quiet. "He wasn't just feeding Obsidian operational intelligence," Marcus said. "He was building a case for replacing you." The morning light was coming through the windows gray and thin, the particular colorlessness of Seattle in October, and Jamin sat with the phone against his ear and the weight of it moved through him differently than the other weights of the past week. This one was physical, actually physical, a tightening across his chest and shoulders that he recognized as the body's response to a specific kind of violation, not market exposure, not reputational risk, personal. "Get here early," he said. "Ama?" Victor arrived at 8:52. He came through the parking structure as instructed, and Marcus met him at the elevator and brought him directly to the boardroom rather than Jamin's office, which was deliberate. The boardroom was the room of record, the room where everything that happened had witnesses and weight. Jamin was already seated at the head of the table. Raymond Choi was to his right. Patricia Wells, his general counsel, was to his left with a legal pad and the particular expression of a woman who has been briefed and is not surprised by what she's been briefed on. Victor stopped when he saw the configuration. His face did something, a rapid, involuntary recalibration, the expression of a man who had come in expecting a conversation and found a proceeding. "Sit down, Victor," Jamin said. Victor sat. He was wearing a jacket over an open collar, no tie, the specific dishevelment of a man who had been told to come in on short notice and had dressed for the ambiguity. He put his hands on the table and looked at Jamin steadily. "The audit," Jamin said. "I assume Marcus told you." 14 months, Jamin said. The side letters were not an impulse. The Q3 review was not opportunistic. You have been systematically extracting documentation from this company's most sensitive holdings for 14 months, Victor. You gave some of it to Obsidian Ventures and you kept some of it for yourself. He paused. "The succession documents. What were you planning to do with those?" Victor's jaw moved. "I was protecting myself." "From what?" "From exactly this." His voice went harder. "From a moment where you decided I was expendable. You do that, Jamin. You build people up as long as they're useful, and when the landscape changes you—" "I did not ask for your analysis of my management style," Jamin said. "I asked what you were planning to do with documents that contain my personal trust structure and executive continuity provisions." Silence. "Victor, I was building leverage," Victor said. "In case I needed it, that's all." "Leverage against me?" "Yes." The word landed in the room and sat there. Patricia Wells wrote something on her legal pad without looking up. Jamin looked at Victor for a long moment. 11 years, the working breakfast, the crisis management, the trips to Seoul and Singapore and Vancouver, and the particular shorthand of men who have navigated serious pressure together. And what he felt was not rage, because rage was for situations where something could have been different, and this could not have been different because it had already happened. And what you felt about things that had already happened was not the point. "Patricia will walk you through the legal position," Jamin said. "You'll have counsel provided. Everything you took, every document, every file, every copy, will be identified and recovered. If there's a version of this that doesn't end in prosecution, it runs through full cooperation. That conversation starts today." Victor looked at him. "That's it?" he said. 11 years, and that's it, Jamin said. Victor looked at him for another moment with an expression that moved through several things. Anger, then something more like grief, then the specific blankness of a man who has used up his reserves and arrived at the far side of them. He nodded. Jamin stood, which was the signal the meeting was over, and left the room, and Marcus fell into step beside him in the hallway. "Board meeting is at 2, Marcus said. "I know. There are 12 reporters outside the building. Carson Reed published a follow-up piece at 6 a.m. It's getting significant pickup." "I know." "Jamin." Marcus stopped walking, which meant Jamin stopped walking because Marcus did not stop without reason. "What's the plan?" Jamin looked at him. "I'm going to tell the board the truth," he said. Marcus looked back at him steadily. "Which truth?" "All of it." A pause. "Your communications team is going to have a significant problem with that approach." "My communications team has been managing a lie for 24 years. They can have a problem with it." He started walking again. "Get me Serena Park's direct contact, not through Obsidian's main office. Personal cell if you can find it." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll find it." Malik was in the Obsidian offices, a clean, spare suite on the 22nd floor of a building on 2nd Avenue, glass and gray and deliberately anonymous, when Serena appeared in his doorway at 10:15. "Jamin's CSO just called my personal cell," she said. Malik looked up from the document he was reading. "He asked for 30 minutes, Serena said. "Today. He said to tell you it's not a negotiation. It's a disclosure." The morning outside of the window was the same gray October it had been all week, the sky sitting low and flat over the water. Malik set down the document. He had been awake since before 5. He had spent the early hours, after his text exchange with Jamin the night before, after the 4 words his father had sent back and the silence that followed them, sitting at the window of his apartment with the particular restlessness of a man whose 7-year plan had arrived at its operational peak and found him not quite where he'd expected to be. The plan was working. Every position was live or nearly live. Cascade Freight, the cold storage operation, the customs brokerage, all three holding, all three ready to activate on his instruction. The blog piece had done what he'd calculated it would do to institutional confidence. The board meeting was this afternoon, and whatever came out of it, Blackstone's position was structurally weakened in a way that would require months to stabilize, even if Jae-min handled the next 72 hours perfectly. The plan was working, and Malik was sitting at his window feeling the specific unsettling sensation of a man who had aimed at something for so long that hitting it revealed the thing he'd been using the aim to avoid looking at. He had sent Jae-min the document because his mother had asked him to. She had asked him quietly over the kitchen table with the 14 pages between them. She had said, "I want him to see it before it publishes. Not as a weapon, as a fact. I want him to know what exists and make a choice about who he's going to be in the face of it." Malik had said, "You're giving him a way out." She had said, "I'm giving him a choice." Those are different things. He can take the choice, or he can let the document run. Either way, I need to know what kind of man he is when no one is forcing his hand. Malik had looked at his mother across the table. He had spent 26 years watching her operate with the consistency of someone who had decided, at a foundational level, that the way you moved through the world mattered as much as where you arrived. He had not always agreed with that framework. He had, in fact, spent 7 years building a counter-argument to it in the form of a targeting system that prioritized arrival over method. But sitting across from her that morning, he had felt something shift. Not capitulation, not a collapse of his position. Something more like recognition. "Tell him yes," Malik said to Serena. 2:00. "Here." Serena's expression moved slightly. "You're bringing him to our office." "Yes." "That's a significant Yule." "I know what it is," Malik said. "Tell him yes, Bo." Jae-min came alone. He came through the building lobby at 1:58, no security, no assistant, in the same dark coat he'd worn to harbor grind the previous morning. The lobby staff didn't know who he was. The building housed a dozen companies, and the obsidian signage was minimal by design. And he rode the elevator to the 22nd floor with the particular composed stillness of a man who had decided, somewhere in the past 18 hours, to stop performing composure and simply be still. Serena Park met him at the elevator. She was 41, precise, with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had spent her career reading people across tables and had developed strong opinions about what she was seeing. She had built the obsidian legal structure over 6 years. She had met Victor Hanley, taken his documentation, and correctly assessed that he would eventually return to Jae-min because men like Victor always did. They needed the authority they were betraying more than they needed the escape from it. She had been right about that. She looked at Jae-min now with the attention of someone seeing a subject they'd studied extensively for the first time in person. "Mr. Kang," she said. "Ms. Park." He looked around the office briefly. The glass, the gray, the deliberate anonymity of a space that had been designed to reveal nothing. He chose his space well. "He chooses most things well," Serena said. She led him to the conference room. Malik was standing when Jae-min entered. He was standing at the window, facing out, and he turned when he heard the door. And the two of them were in the same room for the first time in 26 years, which meant for the first time in any functional sense. And the silence that followed the turn had a specific, enormous weight to it, the weight of everything that hadn't happened in the space between them. Jae-min looked at his son. The photograph had prepared him for the physical resemblance, and still the physical resemblance hit him in a way the photograph had not. Because photographs were documentation, and this was actual, present, breathing. The jaw, the height, the particular way he held his shoulders, all of it assembled in a living person who was looking at him with an expression that was not warm and not hostile and was more controlled and more costly than either. Malik looked at his father. He had told himself, over years, that this moment would be operational. That when it arrived, he would be inside the plan, and the plan would structure his responses, and the distance he'd built would hold. He had told himself that, and he had believed it the way you believe something you have rehearsed so thoroughly that the rehearsal and the belief have become indistinguishable. He had been wrong about that. What he felt? Standing at the window, looking at a man who had his jawline and his height and the specific forward-leaning weight of a person who had been building something their whole life, was not operational. It was not structured. It was something that had no name in the vocabulary of strategic planning, something that lived below the plan and below the 7 years of execution and below the 26 years of absence, something that was simply the particular, devastating weight of standing in front of a fact that had shaped your entire life. "Sit down," Malik said. His voice was level. He had that much. They sat across from each other at the conference table. Jamin put his hands flat on the surface, looked at them briefly, then looked up. "I want to tell you something," Jamin said, "before anything else, before whatever this meeting is and whatever comes out of it." He paused. "What you built, the structure, the execution, the patience of it, I have been in this industry for 40 years, and I have not seen anything built the way you built this. I'm not saying that to flatter you. I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because you should hear it from me specifically, and because I understand what it cost." Malik looked at him. "That's not what I brought you here to talk about," Malik said. "I know. Then why are you saying it?" "Because I've spent 24 years not saying the things I should have said. I'm trying to stop doing that." Jamin's voice was even, not soft, even. "You reached out last night. You sent me the document. Your mother asked you to. I want to know what she wants from this." "She wants you to make a choice without her engineering the outcome," Malik said. "She wants to know who you are when no one is forcing the question." "The board meets in 2 hours." "I know." "Victor Hanley spent 14 months building a case to remove me. He gave your people operational documentation. He was planning to use my personal succession documents as leverage." Jamin paused. "He came to you. He came to Serena. We took what was useful and ended the conversation." "You used him." Malik held his gaze. "He came to us." "I know." Jamin was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying I understand now why you made that choice, and I want you to know I understand it." He paused. "Because I made a version of the same choice in 2001. I looked at what was useful and I took it and I ended the conversation. And the difference between you and me is that you knew exactly what you were doing, and I told myself I was being practical." The room was very still. Outside, Seattle moved through its ordinary Tuesday, indifferent to the specific gravity of the 22nd floor. Malik looked at his father. His hands were flat on the table. His face was doing the thing, the over-stillness, the careful management. And somewhere underneath that stillness, something was moving that he was not going to let move in this room. Not yet, not in front of this man, because some doors you opened slowly and only when you were sure of the floor on the other side. "What are you going to tell the board?" Malik said. "The truth," Jamin said. "Which part?" "All of it." He looked at Malik steadily. "The obsidian position, Victor's activity, the company's actual exposure, and the reason the company is in this position, the specific reason, starting 24 years ago with a press conference in this city where I stood in front of cameras and made a choice that built the foundation everything else was built on." He paused. "I'm going to tell them who you are and who your mother is and what I did." Malik's face didn't move. "That will destroy you," Malik said. "Possibly. The stock won't recover. The institutional investors will. I know. You spent 40 years building. I know what I spent." Jamin's voice was still level. "I know exactly what I spent, and I know what I spent it on. And I know what I built under it and what happened to the things I built on top of that." He looked at his son. "You sent me the document because she asked you to. She asked you to because she wanted to know if I'd make a real choice when I had one. I'm making it." Malik was quiet. He was looking at his father with the expression of someone whose 7-year plan has just been picked up and placed in a context it was not originally designed for. And the recalibration happening behind his eyes was not strategic. It was something older and less manageable. The recalibration of a man who had built an entire structure on a specific assumption about who his father was and is now sitting 3 feet from evidence that the assumption may have been incomplete. "She doesn't know you're doing this," Malik said. "No." "She'll be in that story." "I know. I will ask the board for permission to make a public statement before anything leaks from the room. I will ask for 48 hours to do it correctly. And before I make any public statement, I will go to her and I will ask her permission for how her name is used." He paused. "Not her forgiveness. Her permission. Those are different things." Something moved through Malik's face. Something that was not the overstillness. Why are you telling me this before you tell her? Malik said. Jamin looked at him. Because she has rules, he said. And one of her rules is that communication with me goes through her. And you're about to have to decide whether to tell her this happened before I get there or whether to let me get there first. He paused. I'm not asking you to keep it from her. I'm asking you to let me walk through her door with this still mine to give. The silence in the room was different from all the previous silences. Malik looked at his father for a long time. His hands were still flat on the table. His face had done something it did very rarely. The management had slipped, not completely, but enough that what was underneath was briefly visible, and what was underneath was 26 years of a question he had been building a $7 billion answer to. And the question was not about money, and was not about the Pacific Corridor, and was not about Blackstone Global's stock price. The question was simpler and older and lived in the place where the redirect had been practiced until it became invisible. If you walk into that board meeting today and say what you're saying you're going to say, Malik said, his voice careful and precise and slightly lower than it had been, Blackstone doesn't survive it intact. You understand that? Yes. Everything you've built? Yes. And you're making that choice. Jamin looked at his son across the table. I made the wrong choice once, he said. I've been making the wrong choice about it every day since. I'm 61 years old, and I am done being a man who makes the wrong choice because the right one costs something. His voice didn't break. It was something other than breaking. It was the voice of a man who has reached the far end of a very long road and found himself there without most of what he'd carried. I am done. Malik held his gaze. Neither of them moved. The clock on the wall of the obsidian conference room read 1:17. The board meeting was in 43 minutes. And somewhere 3 blocks south of where they were sitting, in a tea house called Slow Current, a woman was setting cups on a counter and watching the October light move across her floor and waiting, not impatiently, not desperately, with the specific quality of patience that had outlasted everything life had thrown at it. For someone to finally, actually, without strategy or calculation, or Jamin left the Obsidian offices at 1:31. He had 29 minutes before the board meeting. He used 11 of them walking to Slow Current. He walked the way he'd walked into Harbor Grind 2 days before, alone, no security, no assistant, in the dark coat with his hands in his pockets, and the October cold coming off the water, and the ordinary Seattle afternoon moving around him with the complete indifference of a city that did not know and would not particularly care what one man was about to do. He passed a coffee cart and a dry cleaner and 2 women talking outside a nail salon and a teenager on a bicycle who cut too close to the curb and had to overcorrect. And none of it registered as anything other than the world doing what the world does, while the specific interior weather of one specific life reached what felt like the final edge of something. He had left Malik sitting at the conference table. He had not asked for an answer. He had laid out what he intended to do, and he had asked for the chance to deliver it to Nia himself. And he had stood up and left without knowing whether Malik would call her before he got there. That uncertainty was real, and he was not going to manage it. He was going to walk through the door and find out what he found. The bell above Slow Current's entrance chimed when he pushed it open. The tea house was in its mid-afternoon quiet. 2 customers at separate tables, one reading, one on a laptop. The low, ambient warmth of a room that had been heated by occupation and tea, and the particular lived-in comfort of a space that had been genuinely inhabited for years. The walls held framed photographs and a hand-lettered menu board, and a collection of small ceramic pots on a shelf near the window that caught the thin afternoon light with the patient quality of objects that had been chosen carefully and placed to stay. Nia was behind the counter. She looked up when the bell chimed, and she saw him, and her hands, which had been wrapping something in paper, went still. She did not move toward him. She did not move away. She looked at him with an expression that contained no performance. Not anger, not welcome, not the carefully maintained neutrality she'd brought to Harbor Grind. Just the direct, unmediated attention of a woman who had not been expecting him and was deciding in real time what his presence meant. You're not supposed to be here without... She started. I know, he said. I'm sorry. I need 5 minutes. I'm walking into a board meeting in 18 minutes, and I need to tell you something before I go into that room. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came around the counter, went to the door, flipped the sign to closed without commentary, and gestured toward the back table, the one farthest from the 2 customers, tucked against the wall where the noise of the room fell away. He followed her. They sat. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the same direct attention, waiting. "I met with Malik," Jamin said. "He's going to tell you about it. I asked him to let me get here first. I don't know if he honored that." He paused. "The board meeting today. There are things they need to hear about the company's position, about the Obsidian structure, about Victor Hanley." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her, "and about why the company is in this position. The real reason, starting with a decision I made in 2001 and built everything else on top of." Nia was very still. "I'm going to tell them who you are," he said, "and who Malik is, and what I did. And I'm going to do it in a room full of people who will have the information before the afternoon is over, and I cannot stop what happens after that. I cannot control how your name is used or what the press does with it or how it lands." He held her gaze. "I am asking your permission. Not for forgiveness, not for anything else. Just your permission to tell the truth about my own life, which includes you and includes your son, and to let that truth be in the world." The two customers in the front of the shop were unaware of this conversation. The laptop person typed something. The reader turned a page. The afternoon light moved across the floor of slow current with the slow patience of light that had nowhere else to be. Nia looked at Jae-min. She had been looking at him, on and off, for 24 years. Not literally, but in the interior sense, the way you look at something that shaped you even when it's not in front of you. She had looked at him in the Multnomah County Courthouse and in the apartment in Portland, and through the screen of a press conference replay she had watched once, and never watched again, and in the features of the son she'd raised alone, who had his jawline and his height, and she knew now his capacity for the specific, sustained patience of someone aiming at something over a very long arc. She had looked at him, and she had built a life that did not require him to be anything other than what he was. And what he was, sitting across from her now at the back table of her tea house with 18 minutes before the meeting that was going to determine what remained of what he'd built, what he was, she understood, was a man who had finally located the thing he'd been running from for 40 years and had stopped running. Not because he was brave, because he was out of road. But that was something. Running out of road was something. Some people ran out of road and kept running anyway, into the air, until gravity did what gravity did. This man had stopped. He was sitting in her tea house with his hands on the table and the particular stillness of a person who has put down a very heavy thing. "You don't need my permission," she said. "It's your life. You tell it how it actually was." He absorbed that. "I want your permission," he said. "Why?" "Because it's your life too. And his. And I took enough from both of you without asking. I'm not doing that again." Nia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell the truth. That's all. Don't manage it and don't shape it. And don't find a version that protects you. Just tell it the way it happened." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then you have my permission." He stood. He looked at her for a moment, standing at the back table of her tea house on a Tuesday afternoon with the low light and the smell of tea and the sound of the city muffled through the glass, and the two of them standing in the specific gravity of a shared history that was not shared willingly and was not shared equally and could not be undone. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "Go," she said. "You'll be late." He went. The board meeting lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Jae-min told them everything. He told them about Obsidian Ventures and the acquisition structure and the 3 activated positions, and what Victor Hanley had done, and what the company's actual operational exposure looked like, stripped of the managed narrative he'd been presenting for the past week. He told them the numbers without softening them. He told them about the side letters and what their exposure in an adversarial renegotiation looked like, and how many months of operational stability they realistically had. And then he told them the rest. He told them about Portland in 2001 and the Choi partnership offer and the calculation he'd made. He told them about the courthouse and the press conference and the no he'd said on camera. He told them about Nia Caldwell and about the son she'd raised and about Obsidian Ventures being, at its foundation, not a corporate raider or a competitor or a hostile acquisition entity, but a man in his 20s who had built a $7 billion answer to a question his father had never been willing to hear. He told them he had spent 24 years maintaining a lie as a structural element of the company's public narrative, and that the company's current crisis was, at its root, the consequence of that maintenance. He told them he was not going to manage this. He was going to make a public statement within 48 hours that said what he just said to them, and they could decide after that statement what the company's leadership looked like going forward, and he would support whatever they decided. The room was very quiet for a long time after he finished. Then Raymond Choi, who had been CFO for 9 years, and who had the specific quality of a man who dealt with the actual numbers regardless of what the narrative around them was, said, "What does Obsidian want?" Jamin said, "I don't know yet." Raymond said, "Then we need to find out before you make any public statement, because the public statement changes the negotiating position." Jamin looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm making it." The public statement went out at 11 a.m. on Thursday. Not a press release, not a prepared media event. Jamin requested airtime on the local evening news, was denied, and instead posted a 22-minute video directly to Blackstone Global's public website and social channels, filmed in his office. No graphics, no teleprompter, no communications team in the room. He sat behind his desk in a plain dark jacket, and he talked. He said what he'd said to the board in language stripped of corporate framing. He said he had built his company on a lie, and the lie had a specific shape, and here was the shape. He used names. He said Nia Caldwell's name, and he said Malik Caldwell's name, and he said the name of the county courthouse where they'd been married, and he described what he'd done at the 2001 press conference without the word strategy or the word necessity or any of the vocabulary of self-defense. He said, "I was afraid. That's the honest word for it. I was afraid, and I dressed it up in better words for 24 years, and everyone who worked for me and invested in this company deserves to know that the foundation included that." He said, "Nia Caldwell built a life and raised a son without anything from me, without my name or my money or my presence. What she built is worth more than anything I built. I'm saying that out loud because it is accurate, and because she has never needed me to say it, and so there is no angle in saying it. It is just true." He said, "My son is Malik Caldwell. He built Obsidian Ventures. He built it better than I built what I built, and he built it in less time, and he built it with less to start from. I have met him once. I do not have the right to be proud of him. I am saying what he accomplished because it is accurate and because it happened regardless of me, and that is the kind of fact that should be in the world." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. He said, "The board will make decisions about leadership. I will support those decisions. The company's operational position has been disclosed fully to the board and will be disclosed to investors through appropriate channels. There is nothing else I am managing or hiding. This is everything." He sat in the frame for a moment after he finished. Then he reached forward and ended the recording. The video got 4 million views in the first 24 hours. The stock dropped another 9% the morning after it posted, and then, over the following 3 days, began, slowly, tentatively, without any particular logic that the financial press could agree on, to recover. Not fully, not quickly. But the bottom held, which was not what most people had predicted. What the financial analysts did not fully account for in their models was the specific human response to watching a man tell the truth about himself on camera without asking for anything in return. It was unusual enough that people forwarded it, and the forwarding reached demographics that did not typically pay attention to corporate leadership statements. And the conversation that developed in those demographics was not about Blackstone's stock price. Victor Hanley's cooperation with the internal audit produced a full accounting of the documentation he'd transferred. His legal process proceeded quietly. He did not speak publicly. He left Seattle in February. Kim Dawson's piece ran in the Post 6 weeks after the video, a longer and more nuanced version than the draft that had been on hold. It treated Nia Caldwell with the specificity of good reporting, her business, her history, her son, and Nia had given a single interview for it, 45 minutes, at a table in Slow Current, which Kim Dawson described in the piece as a room that felt like it had been built by someone who understood the specific value of things that take time. The first snow of the season came early to Seattle that year, a thin, temporary dusting in late November that surprised everyone and melted before noon. Nia was standing at the front window of Slow Current watching it come down when her phone buzzed with a text from Malik. He wrote, "Can I come by tonight? I want to talk." She wrote back, "I'll make dinner." He arrived at 6:30 with wine she wouldn't drink and a paper bag from the Vietnamese place, and the particular forward-leaning urgency of his walk slightly slowed, which she noticed because she noticed everything about him, and because the slowness was new and the newness of it meant something. They ate at her kitchen table. For the first 20 minutes, they talked about ordinary things. The tea house's November numbers, which were good, a problem with a supplier she'd resolved, a book he'd been trying to read on planes. They talked the way people who are approaching something important talk around the edges of it first, making sure the ground is solid before they walk to the center. Then Malik set down his fork and said, "He called me." She looked at him. "Yesterday," Malik said. "He called my cell. He asked if we could meet again." A pause. "He said he didn't have an agenda. He said he wanted to know, and this is what he said exactly. He said he wanted to know if I'd be willing to tell him something about how I grew up. Not to fix anything, just to know." Nia was quiet. "What did you say?" she said. "I said I'd think about it." She looked at her son across the kitchen table. 26 years old, controlled and brilliant, and built out of circumstances that would have broken people twice his age, with his father's jaw and her eyes, and something underneath both of those things that was entirely his own, forged in the specific heat of being raised by a woman who refused to let lack of fairness become a reason to stop moving. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked at the table for a moment. "I'm thinking that I built a 7-year plan to make a man feel the weight of what he did, and I executed it correctly. And he felt it." He paused. "And I'm sitting here and the weight isn't gone." She didn't say anything. "I thought it would change something," he said. "I thought if he understood, if he actually had to stand inside the consequences, that it would change something in here." He touched his chest briefly with 2 fingers, unconsciously mirroring a gesture she made. It didn't change it. It just moved it into a different shape. She watched him. "The weight doesn't go away," she said. "That's not how it works. I know you wanted it to work that way. I know that's what the plan was built on." She kept her voice level and without softness or its opposite. "The weight is yours. It was always going to be yours. What you do with it, that's the part you get to decide." He looked at her. "Do you still carry it?" he said. She considered that with the honesty it deserved. "Some days," she said. "Less than I used to. Not because he said the right things or did the right things. Because I got tired of carrying the extra weight of what he should have been. I put that part down a while ago." She paused. "I kept my own part. You don't put down your own part." Malik was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to call him back." She nodded. "Not because I forgive him," he said. I don't know if that's where this goes. I'm not making that call tonight. I'm just going to talk to him." "That's all it needs to be," she said. They finished dinner and did the dishes together in the quiet, companionable way of 2 people who had shared a kitchen for a long time, and the snow was gone, and the Seattle night was clear and cold outside the window. And when Malik left at 9:30, he hugged her at the door for slightly longer than usual, which she did not comment on, and she stood at the window and watched him walk down the street until he turned the corner. Boss, Jamin showed up at Slow Current for the first time on a Sunday in December. He did not come unannounced. He had called Nia the previous Thursday and asked if Sunday morning might be acceptable, and she had said yes, and he had come at 10 o'clock when the tea house was open but not yet busy, in a plain jacket with no security, and he had ordered tea at the counter and paid for it and sat at a table near the window, and he had stayed for 1 hour and then he had left. He did not ask for anything. He did not try to prolong it. He came the following Sunday, and the one after that. By the 4th Sunday, Nia had stopped noticing the slightly effortful quality of his sitting, the controlled, careful way of a man who was not accustomed to occupying a space without an agenda. By the 6th Sunday, he was reading while he drank his tea, a habit she found both ordinary and, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, unexpectedly moving. A man learning to sit still. It was such a basic thing, and he was learning it late, and he was learning it in her tea house on Sunday mornings, which was not something she had planned for and was not something she had asked for, and was, she was beginning to understand, something she did not precisely object to. She did not speak to him much in those early weeks. Sometimes she brought his second cup herself, rather than sending her weekend staff. Sometimes she sat at the counter near enough that they were in the same space in a way that was not a conversation and was not its absence. Small calibrations. She was not performing warmth she did not have. She was not performing distance she no longer fully felt either. She was being accurate. That was the word she used to herself. The Lunar New Year dinner happened in February. She organized it at her apartment above the tea house, the small dining room that could fit 10 people with the leaf extended on the table. And she had invited her closest friends and her cousin from Portland and a woman named Grace, who had been Malik's unofficial aunt since he was 3 years old, and who had cried when she saw the video Jamin posted in November, and then called Nia and said, "Are you all right?" And Nia had said, "I'm always all right." And Grace had said, "That's not what I asked," which was why she was on the short list for everything that mattered. She had invited Jamin on the Wednesday before. She had done it plainly, in a text. "I'm having a Lunar New Year dinner Friday. If you want to come at 7. It's informal. It is not a reconciliation, and it is not a negotiation. It's dinner." He had written back in under a minute. "Thank you. I'll be there." She showed the text to Malik when he came to help set up Friday afternoon. He read it and handed the phone back and went back to moving chairs without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "Who else is coming?" She told him. He was quiet again, then, "Okay. Are you okay?" He looked at her. "I talked to him twice this week," he said. "On the phone. We talked for, He stopped. "A while about... I told him some things about growing up in Tacoma, the apartment, the night job." He paused. He didn't say anything for a long time after. Then he said, "I'm sorry," just that. 2 words. Malik looked at the table he was setting. It wasn't enough. Obviously it wasn't enough. 2 words for 26 years is not... He stopped again, picked up a fork and placed it with the specific deliberate care of someone managing their hands. But it was the first time he said it and meant it. I could tell the difference. Nia watched him. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah," he said. They set the table together. Sit. Jamin arrived at 7 o'clock exactly. He brought wine he'd asked Nia in advance whether was appropriate, and brought it in a plain paper bag and handed it at the door to Grace, who took it without introduction and went to the kitchen with it, which was either rude or entirely comfortable depending on your relationship to ceremony, and Jamin appeared to correctly read it as comfortable because something in his shoulders moved slightly downward. The first hour was not easy. Grace watched him with the specific, unblinking assessment of a woman who has watched her closest friend navigate 24 years of something and has opinions. Nia's cousin Marcus, not the Marcus Reed of Blackstone, a different Marcus, a woodworker from Portland with large hands and a slow way of speaking, shook Jamin's hand and asked him what he did, and then listened to the answer without filling the silence that followed it, which was a particular form of social pressure that Jamin was not accustomed to and navigated imperfectly. Malik arrived at 7:20. He came through the door and the room reconfigured itself around his arrival the way rooms do when someone important to the room enters. Not loudly, just a shift in where people's attention was directed. Jamin stood. He stood because he stood whenever anyone entered a room. It was a trained reflex, professional. And then he realized it might be read differently in this context, and he had already done it, so he stood. Malik looked at him. The room was watching without appearing to watch. Malik crossed to the table, noted the available chairs. There were 2 empty ones, one near Grace and one nearer to where Jamin was standing, and chose the one near Grace, who patted his arm once when he sat, the abbreviated physical shorthand of a woman who had been doing that since he was 3. Jamin sat back down. The room exhaled without making a sound. Dinner was loud and specific in the way of dinners among people who know each other well, overlapping conversations, an argument about a restaurant that had recently closed that Marcus felt strongly about, Grace telling a story about something Malik had done at age 7 that made everyone laugh, including Malik, who covered his face with one hand and shook his head. Jamin was mostly quiet. He ate. He answered questions when they were directed at him. He did not perform ease he didn't have. What he did, and Nia noticed this from her position at the other end of the table, was pay attention. He watched the table with the specific, focused attention of a man who understood he was being allowed to see something he had no inherent right to see and who was not going to waste it. He watched Grace and Malik. He watched how Grace spoke to him, the shorthand, the ease, the complicated warmth of someone who had functioned as family in the absence of other family. He watched Malik when Malik was talking, the way he gestured when something genuinely interested him, and the way he went still when something landed close to home. He watched those things with the careful, unflinching attention of a man building a picture of 26 years of a life he had not been present for. It cost him. She could see that it cost him. She did not soften it. After dinner, while Marcus and Grace were doing dishes, an argument they both clearly wanted to have and that served the structural purpose of removing themselves from the room, Malik and Jamin ended up at the far end of the living room, near the window, in something that was not quite a private conversation and was not accidental. Nia was at the table with her tea and she did not move toward them. She let it be whatever it was going to be. She watched her son talking to his father in the low light of her living room, both of them standing, both of them with the slightly forward-leaning posture they shared, both of them with their hands not quite at rest. She watched that for a while. She felt something move through her chest that was neither grief nor relief, something that didn't have a ready name and didn't need one, something that had taken 24 years to arrive at and was now simply present, in the room, real. The Caldwell Foundation was announced in March. Malik stood at a small podium in a hotel conference room with 40 journalists and held a press conference that lasted exactly 31 minutes. He explained the foundation's mandate, supporting mixed-race children and single-parent families facing institutional and social discrimination, and its operational structure and its initial endowment, which was drawn from the restructured Blackstone assets Obsidian had acquired across 7 years. He announced the chairman of the board. There was a murmur in the room when he said the name. Kang Jae-min accepted the position without a prepared statement. He stood at the podium after Malik stepped aside and he said 3 sentences, that the appointment was undeserved and he understood that he intended to spend the remainder of whatever years he had making the work of the foundation the central work of his life, that he had been given an opportunity he did not earn and would try every day to be worth it. He did not say who had given him the opportunity. Journalists who watched the press conference footage noted that when Jae-min finished his 3 sentences and stepped back, he looked briefly to the left of the room's entrance before he looked anywhere else. Naya was standing there. She was not part of the press conference. She was in a gray cardigan with her bag over one shoulder and a cup of tea from the hotel lobby that she'd been holding long enough to go cold, and she was watching. When Jae-min looked at her, she did not smile. She held his gaze for a moment with the specific, direct quality of attention she had brought to every encounter with him since Harbor Grind, the attention of a woman who was being accurate rather than performing anything. Then she gave him a single brief nod. That was all. It was sufficient. Thus, spring arrived in Seattle the way it always did. Gradually, then suddenly, the cherry trees along the waterfront going from bare to extravagant over the span of a week. The cold lifting in increments that you didn't fully notice until one morning you stepped outside and the air was different. Slow current was open, as it always was on Sunday mornings. Nia had been there since 7:30, going through the week's ordering, listening to the neighborhood wake up outside the windows. By 9:30, the light was coming through the front glass at the particular angle it hit in spring, warm and specific, falling across the counter and the floor and the shelf of ceramic pots in the way it only did for about 6 weeks a year, and she stood behind the counter and looked at it and felt the ordinary, uncelebrated pleasure of a room she had built being filled with light. Malik arrived at 10 with the 2-bell chime. He was dressed for something, not a suit, but with more intention than his usual Sunday casual. And when he came to the counter, she raised an eyebrow. "I'm meeting him at 11, he said. "The foundation, first operations review." "How do you feel about it?" He considered that honestly. "Uncertain," he said. "Which I don't like." A pause. "But not bad uncertain, just the other kind." She handed him a cup without asking. He took it and stood at the counter, and they were quiet together for a moment, the tea house doing its Sunday morning business around them. "He called me Thursday night," Malik said. "We talked for 2 hours." She looked at him. "He told me about Portland," he said, "the apartment, the view from the window, what he was thinking during those 3 days. He looked at his tea. He told me about the courthouse. He described your coat. She was quiet. He said green, Malik said. She looked at the light coming through the front window for a moment. It was green, she said. Malik looked at her. Something in his face had the quality of something very carefully held being very carefully set down, not released, not dropped, but placed, deliberately, in a place he'd chosen. I know I'm not there yet, he said. With him. I know I don't... He stopped, started again. I know what it is isn't what it would have been. I know there are 26 years that are just gone. Not fixable. He paused. But I'm not carrying it the same way. She looked at her son. That's enough, she said. That's a lot, actually. He nodded. They drank their tea while the Sunday morning light moved across the floor of slow current, shifting by increments the way light does, the way most things do, not in declarations, but in the slow dailiness of showing up, of the small, repeated gestures that accumulate into something you can eventually call changed. At 10:55, Malik put his cup down, straightened his jacket, kissed her on the cheek, and went. She watched him through the window as he crossed the street and turned toward the waterfront, walking the way he always walked, forward-leaning, certain of his feet, moving with the particular momentum of a man who had somewhere to be. He turned the corner and was gone. She stood at the window for a moment with her hands around her own cup, the tea warm against her palms, the cherry blossoms drifting past the glass in the light spring air, and she felt it, the weight that was still there, that would always be there in some form, and the other thing underneath it, the thing that had survived 26 years of difficulty and absence and single motherhood and financial hardship and the daily grinding work of building a life from nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not forgiveness, which was its own thing and moved on its own timeline. Something quieter than those. The specific, plain, earned knowledge of a woman who had built everything she valued with her own hands, who had raised a son who knew where the door was and had chosen to walk through it, who had set a table she didn't owe anyone and watched someone learn, slowly, to deserve a seat at it. Outside, the cherry blossoms fell the way they always fall. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the ordinary release of something that has finished being one thing and is becoming another, drifting in the light above the Seattle waterfront, while the city moved through its Sunday morning and slow current held its warmth and the 3 cups on the counter released their thin trails of steam into the quiet air. An empire survived, not intact, transformed, into something smaller and more honest than what it had been, which turned out to be worth more. A son thrived, not healed. That word was too clean for what was actually true. Carrying what he carried, but differently. Moving forward the way his mother had taught him, not by putting the weight down, but by deciding it was not going to be the thing that determined his direction. A mother remained, unbroken, which had never been the same thing as undamaged. Unbroken in the deeper sense, the sense that the current had not stopped and had not broken, that it had moved through every obstacle by finding the way through, which was all it had ever needed to do. And a man who had once stood in front of cameras and said no was spending his Sundays in a tea house in Seattle, learning to drink tea slowly, learning to sit in a room without an agenda, learning the particular and difficult and entirely unspectacular work of becoming someone who deserved to be there. Not forgiven yet, not fully, but present. And in the vocabulary of people who had been absent for a very long time, present was where everything else had to start.